Hey YouTubers, this is Richie B from Waffle Free Tech and welcome to my channel. Today I want to look at these things. Well, not specifically this Sony VR headset, but VR in general. And I want to kind of ask the question, is VR dead in 2019? Well, let's take a look and find out. So before we can answer the question of whether or not VR is dead in 2019 or the future of VR is dead, we need to kind of take a look at the past history of VR and where it's come from. So let's take a stroll down memory lane and look at the history. So when exactly did the first VR headset, come about? Well, the first head-mounted display was in 1961, a company called the Philco Corporation, who made this remote viewing headset for the military. So what it allowed them to do is take a camera feed from many miles away and obviously display it in a soldier's headset. Was that the start of the first kind of VR real headset? Maybe it's not. 7 years later, in 1968, there was a project started by a guy by the name of Ivan Sutherland, and his project was called the Sword of Damocles. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong. And that, you could argue, was the first real kind of VR headset. It did use computer generated graphics, or it'd be very, very simple line generated graphics. It was a head-mounted display, and it did actually have some tracking. So it had some like crude rudimentary magnetic tracking of sort. Wasn't portable, it was built into a building, but it was a VR headset of sorts with tracking. So when did the phrase virtual reality actually come about? Well, you would have to jump forward pretty much nearly 20 years to 1987. There was a guy by the name of Jaron Lanier, hopefully I've got that right, from a company called VPL. He was the first person to coin the phrase virtual reality, and some consider him to be the kind of forefather of VR. So let's jump forward a couple of more years to 1993, 1994-ish. That's when Nintendo released their Virtual Boy, which was kind of a desk-mounted virtual headset. You could wear it on your face, but it was incredibly uncomfortable, really heavy, and it had black and red graphics, and it was horrendous. Here's a sample of one of the graphics. All I can say is, Nintendo, what were you thinking? So how did this come about? Well, I think it was because a year earlier in 1992, VR was popularized by the film The Lawnmower Man. That was people's first real experience of what VR could be or might be. And obviously that's where I think most people became aware of VR. So I think a year later, after Nintendo failed with their Virtual Boy, which I think was scrapped a year later, Sega decided they were going to jump on the bandwagon and give it a try. So they developed their Sega VR headset. I believe they developed 4 games for it. And apart from looking like Robocop when you placed it on your head, it was a step up from the Virtual Boy. It had color graphics. But unfortunately, it never actually got released. Sega apparently gave the excuse for not releasing it as they were worried that their VR headset was so real that people might hurt themselves, and that was the reason it was cancelled. So that actually never made it out to the public. So that was it for that kind of era, 1993, 1994. Let's jump a year ahead again. There was another attempt at VR by another couple of people. There was a headset called the VFX-1, if I remember rightly. And there was also one called eyeglasses by a company called Virtual.io. Now the Virtual I/O eyeglasses was my first ever experience of VR. I got my hands on one of these things, and back in the day, it was pretty good. The displays were only 640 by 40 resolution, but then back then computer graphics weren't great anyway. That was kind of the resolution of the day. It had head tracking. It wasn't too bad. Despite its low resolution, it wasn't too bad at all. But these things died a quick death and never ever made it mainstream. So after the failed headsets of the early 1990s, mid 1990s, not a lot happened for the next 15 years. So let's jump forward obviously to 2010 and a guy called Palmer Luckey, who did the first prototype of a product called the Oculus Rift. I had one of these Oculus Rifts. I think it was the DK2 model, developer model, and the headset tracking working, but the screen door effect was awful, and for me it kind of killed VR because I played a few games on that and it made me so sick. The motion sickness was terrible, to the point where I actually had to sell it. So throughout the next kind of 8-9 years, taking us up till 2019, there've been a number of different headsets. Oculus made new versions. HTC Vive came on the scene. There was a bunch of Kickstarters for products which never saw the light of day, really. We had Microsoft release their HoloLens for businesses at ridiculous amounts of money. So we saw all these different devices, but they all had the same thing in common. They all had the same problem. Pretty much like the PlayStation VR headset. They all had these tons of wires to set up. For me, the PlayStation VR, whilst I love it, it rarely gets used. And this kind of brings me to the question about, is this kind of the death of VR? Well, the reason I ask that question is, for me, it takes half an hour for this thing to kind of acclimatize temperature-wise, to stop it from fogging up. The wires are a nightmare, and it's just a general pain, to use. If you're using it in the room, you can trip over the wires, you can't see what's going on. And I think that is one of the fundamental flaws. So, cue the Oculus Quest from earlier this year. And this is where I question, is the future of VR dead or not? Well, we have Sony with its PlayStation 5. They've said they're looking to develop another PlayStation VR headset. So Sony doesn't seem to think so. We have Facebook, who own Oculus, and obviously they've developed the Quest, and I think they are looking to develop a lot more in the future, to the point where Oculus has actually come out and said they would like to see 1 billion VR devices in people's homes in the future. So certainly Sony and Facebook don't think the future of VR is dead. And for me, whilst I think up until now VR has been a pain to use, I think Facebook's got it right with the Oculus Quest. The headset doesn't require a PC, and it has no wires you can trip over. It's just simple plug and play. That's what people want. You pop it on your head, instant gaming. None of this waiting for it to acclimatize, it just works. But, and this is the big but, is this the future of VR? Yes and no. Have they solved all the problems? Yes and no. So they've solved the problems of the wires, which is great, but there's still a couple of things that they still haven't solved. First is the resolution. The resolution just isn't there yet. In a lot of these games, it's just still too jaggy. There's still the kind of screen door effect that's still there to some extent. So that's the first point. The other thing is that obviously the experience you get on the Oculus Quest, it's nowhere near as good as the wired version. The reason for that is because the wired version has a PC attached, and that has a hulking big computer and a really powerful graphics card to power it. So the portable version of the Oculus Quest that has a mobile chipset, I think it's the Snapdragon 635 if I'm not mistaken, so it's not even the most powerful modern day mobile processor. But the problem you have, it's never ever going to match a desktop PC, so it's always going to be like the poor cousin. So until they solve that and the higher resolution graphics, I don't think it's ever going to go mainstream. And certainly with a mobile processor, I think you're going to struggle to get 4K gaming on a VR headset, which is what it really needs for that higher resolution, with a decent amount of textures to rival a computer. That's what you need. So how are they going to do this? Well, I think Oculus stroke Facebook, HTC Vive, all the players who are still around, they kind of need to take a leaf out of Google's book, because I think they need to learn from Google with their Google Stadia. So instead of trying to cram power and the hardware into these devices to run their graphics, why not let a data center do it? They've got the right idea with the wireless, no wires, great. So why not let a data center do the 4K rendering and just stream it to a device like an Oculus Quest or a PlayStation VR if that's what they're going to do. That way you don't have to worry about how powerful hardware in the actual headset. You just need to drive the screens. That helps bring the price down. You also get the full desktop PC VR experience, the full textures, the higher resolution and the higher frame rates. So I think if they do that, I think they will crack VR, and I think that's when things will become mainstream. So I don't quite think VR is dead yet. I think it's limping along for the time being, and I hope it doesn't die. So let's watch this space and see if my prediction here about streaming to VR headsets comes true in the future. Hopefully it will. So thanks for watching, everybody. As usual, if you could basically leave a comment in the section below, introduce yourself, say hello, and please subscribe to the channel. That way you'll be notified when I release any new videos. And that's pretty much about it. And hopefully I'll see you guys real soon. Bye bye now.